Miss Clayton, please don't move things around in my dollhouse. I have a very particular system. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 6 of season 5, so join us as we continue our watch through of Netflix's The Haunting of Bly Manor. This episode, we are discussing episodes 4 and 5. So if you haven't heard our discussion of the first 3 episodes, you can jump back in our catalog and find those. So, as I just said in the intro, we are tackling episodes 4 and 5 of Haunting of Bly Manor. And before we started recording, we had already started discussing just a little bit because there's a lot of thoughts and a lot of emotions around these 2 episodes, probably episode 5 in particular. But definitely want to start off by giving the obligatory spoiler warning for those of you that haven't watched these episodes yet or haven't watched the season. If you don't want anything spoiled, you definitely are going to want to come back to this at a later time because it's hard to do a watch through and not have any sort of spoilers. So I guess we'll kind of do what we did last time, which is sort of go through episode by episode. And episode 4 is a very interesting one where we get to see a lot of more backstory of Danny. And in particular, we get to see kind of the history of the ghost haunting her that ends up becoming what I had dubbed flashlight eyes. So I'm going to kind of put Lisa on the spot here since you're our guinea pig who hasn't seen these before and has been holding yourself to just watching the episodes as we're getting ready to do these recordings. So what was your reaction on watching this episode?
This episode, I told y'all before we started recording that episodes 4 and 5 were very difficult for me to watch because these episodes, like the way the stories unfold, and this happens a little bit in The Haunting of Hill House, but I feel like it has gotten a little bit better through The Haunting of Bly Manor, in that you know that things have a bad ending, and then you get the backstory to them, which kind of makes it all the more heartbreaking because you fall in love with the characters, but you know their story already has a bad ending. And so I knew from the get-go when this started, and it was obviously like young Danny and at this point we didn't know who it was, but we knew it was the ghost because of the glasses, which had been so prominent, as you said, Matt, with the ghost with flashlight eyes. And we already knew she had the glasses in her possession. So you knew that the kid wearing the glasses was not going to end up alive so much. So already I knew I was kind of stealing myself for this because you see that Danny and Eddie, or I guess Edmund, as we learn is his full name, is they were childhood best friends. I got a little bit of like, what was that movie called? What was the movie with Macaulay Culkin where he gets stung by the bees?
My Girl.
My Girl. Yes. I was getting major My Girl vibes when they were children, but I mean, it didn't linger there, but still that, I don't know. But I guess because I knew like, oh, childhood friends, little boy wears the glasses. They're adorable. He's going to die. Obviously my mind went straight to My Girl anyway. But we see them quickly like move from these kind of childhood best friends to becoming like childhood sweethearts. And then now they're getting ready to get married. And we learned this because she's very nervous and he's kind of psyching her up for what was, I guess, an engagement party that they were about to go into. But you see, as they're there at the party, that she seems very sad already. And so that was enough, I think, of a mystery to kind of follow through the episode, because it was kind of like, okay, we know he's going to die somehow. So this is going to end tragically, but she's already kind of sad and morose and maybe a little depressed, but we don't know why. So there was a lot more to dig at with this episode right from the get-go. At the same time, we are getting the flashbacks to that. In the present day, they were getting ready for the funeral of Owen's mom, Mrs. Sharma. So those were kind of happening simultaneously as we go through this. We learn a few things early on that I kind of, I guess we'll dive into it. I'll just say I thought the way this episode handled a lot of different things were really sweet. I liked seeing a little bit more background and kind of the weight of what she's carrying. Because of course we learn, just fast forwarding in this episode a little bit, that her fiance, she had broken off the wedding, and that was the same night that he died, because they had gotten into a fight, and he leaves they're sitting in a car after dinner, and he gets out of the car rather abruptly because he's upset, and he gets hit by a car as he's exiting. And so it was very traumatic, but then she's also kind of carrying the guilt of everybody thinks she's the bereaved, not quite widow because they weren't married yet, but I think she's also carrying guilt that she feels like it's her fault. If she hadn't have broken off the engagement at that time, or maybe at all, he'd still be alive. And then probably worried about what people will think of her if they knew the whole truth. So she's carrying a lot of secrets. But then you also get kind of this present day family that's being built. And this is something that this show has kind of been building on this season, is because I think it might be, I don't know if it's in this episode or episode 5 where I wrote it down. But Danny is talking to Miles and basically says that you get to pick your humans. Basically, you get to pick the people who are in your life. Like when you've lost family members, you get to kind of have your found family. I think it's in episode 4. And I thought the way everybody came around Owen was really nice in this episode too. At one point, Flora says to him, it comes across very sweet, but also very creepy in the way that Flora only can do. When she just kind of looks at him and says, "You're not dying, that it only feels like dying." And then she explains the reason she knows that is because she felt that way after her parents died, that, she worried she was the only one, that she was dead and that people just didn't know it yet. But then she realized she was alive because she had to be alive to feel that way. And it was really touching, I thought. And the way she was reaching out to Owen to try to help him through his grief, but obviously she was helping Danny too, I think, in that moment. So I don't know. This episode made me feel a lot of things. And there were scary moments. But I think this was mostly one of those kind of character driven episodes, and it was done really well. I guess before we go too in depth, what do you guys think about episode 4?
Episode 4 for me was kind of the one that really hooked me into this season. And I was not on the fence. I was going to watch it all the way through, but I wasn't sure what I thought until I saw this episode. And I like, one of the things that I really like is kind of the nuance of the episode, how they play her seeing Edmund's ghost in the mirror as both her literally being haunted, but also the guilt that she's carrying. And in particular, not just the guilt, but something that you had kind of touched on to like dive a little bit deeper into, which is kind of this two-sided thing. She feels guilty that he's dead, but also she never tells anyone directly that they broke off the engagement. So they still see her as, like you said, this bereaved, almost widow. And so she's kind of dealing with this twofold thing of like the guilt for his literal death, but then also this inability to speak up and say, well, actually, just before he died, I told him I didn't want to get married. Like just having any sort of empathy at all, and putting yourself in those places, like how does somebody even deal with a situation like that? Like, it was so heartbreaking to see her struggling with this. Like, how do you tell the mom of your childhood best friend that before he died you had a fight and broke off your engagement because you weren't really in love with him in that way? Like, I mean, my God, it's heartbreaking. So cheers to Mike Flanagan once again for, well, like you said, like bringing us into these characters' worlds and really like stomping on our hearts while he does it.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you guys have said so far. I feel like, in my mind, when I think back on the episode with Hannah, episode 5, just weighed so heavily on me and just kind of broke my heart that I feel like sometimes I almost look at episodes 4 and 5 as like two-parters of one long thing. But episode 4 also has that emotional punch too. And I think it does bring the viewer in because you're wondering who this person is as she keeps seeing in the mirror. And obviously, as she begins to contemplate a relationship with Jamie, she's haunted more and more by this. The idea of seeing him like putting his hand on her shoulder at the funeral, this almost like possessiveness of the ghost, but it's all coming from her mind to a certain extent. And then there's also the implication that maybe Bly is exacerbating it for her for whatever reason, because it's supernatural or her stress. But, she starts seeing him even outside of mirrors as she starts to contemplate moving on with her life. And, having her have to face that, I think in that episode is a really powerful move while not losing the propulsion of the plot. As you point out, Lisa, the subplots keep us going with what's going on in Bly Manor. Another thing that I liked about this particular episode was, well, a couple things. One is just on the level of how much I love the writing in this show is I think I mentioned in our episodes on Hill House that I always, even though it would be painful usually, I would enjoy the throw off kind of lines that would begin episodes or be in episodes that you knew that the character didn't realize what they were actually saying. And it made it even more painful. And so I didn't even have to know, like you said, Lisa, I knew who was Flashlight Eyes at the very beginning of this episode because you have two kids, one wearing those glasses, and the child, Danny, says something, you're going to have to wear those glasses till you die. And I was like, oh man, like I don't even know what happened. And I like know what happened, right? Like I don't know how it happened, but I know that this is a horrible, horrible thing. And it also seemed like a little bit of a callback to when Flora put the glasses on, because you see Danny wearing the glasses at that point and joking with him. The other thing that I thought worked really well with this episode and kind of leading to that guilt that you were talking about, Matt, is the pressure that Danny feels that she's under this time period in particular, but just in her life. She grows up with a single mother. She doesn't appear to be very close to her. Her father died when she was very young, which is Flora's age. She tells Miles after his Peter Quint possession, screaming about having drinks. So she kind of clings to this best friend of hers, Edmund, and becomes part of his family. Edmund's mother wants a daughter, and you see from the very beginning of the episode the pressure that Danny is under. Like, it was just expected that they were going to marry her whole life, regardless of how she feels about it, or maybe who she even wants to be with. And the writer doesn't bang you over the head with this, but you see it from the engagement party where Edmund says he asked her over and over and over and over and over again, to marry him. And she finally said yes, which probably isn't a good sign to the pressure that the mom puts her under. You can tell, even though the mom says she'll say whatever, the truth to her, that she can't. The fact that Edmund already thinks that she's probably going to want to cancel the marriage makes me think that they've had this discussion before. She's just I felt like she was being kind of railroaded into this, and that she just doesn't know how to stand up against what's going on. And even before he dies, it would be extremely difficult for her to tell everybody who has been having this happen, putting this together this whole time, nope, don't want to do this. I was never really quite interested. And you have that idea where she says, I figured if we were married, I would feel the way I was supposed to, which, later she wants to be in a relationship with Jamie. So I think we know what that means. But I think also like there's this weird way of like, ever since she was very young, people have just been telling her that she's like supposed to be with Edmund because they get along so well together. And I think the great irony before he steps out of the car and gets hit by a truck, which I was like, wow, that is awful. I mean, I almost felt like I was pushing the envelope too much on Danny, because that's intense. I mean, I'm sure it could happen. Crazy, horrible things happen in life, but it just seemed like shocking and terrifying and adds to that guilt. But you have her telling him, I do love you. Like, you're my best friend. That's another thing. If she's got to hurt her best friend and lose that relationship that's meant so much to her in order to get out of this thing that she never wanted to be in the first place. And that just adds so much guilt on her part that she shouldn't have to have carried, but she did anyway. And I just think it makes it that much more powerful when she finally stands up to this part of herself that she can't let go of at the end.
Yeah, I thought that the end scene was done really well as far as like, especially for character development for Danny. They were all sitting around a bonfire. They had put the kids to bed. This was after, as you said, Mel, about Miles having his meltdown about wanting a drink at dinner, which, by the way, just let's put a pin in that scene, because that to me was the most terrifying scene of this episode. Like, so, I mean, seeing Eddie get hit, or Edmund get hit by the car, was obviously terrifying, but I kind of knew that was coming. But for some reason, watching Miles demand alcohol at dinner, just that chilled me to my bone. Anyway, so she sends the kids to bed after his fit at dinner, and they all the adults go outside with wine to have a bonfire. And there's that little discussion that I think Jamie brings up about bonfire being from like the Old English, meaning bone fire, because they couldn't carry bones, like old bones, into winter, become dangerous because they couldn't carry too much with them. And so she talks about like throwing the old bones into the fire and kind of releasing them and releasing some of that burden, which is what Danny does, because she does confess to Jamie eventually. Jamie's the only one that she actually like opens up to and tells everything of what happened. But I did like in the end when she kind of goes out there by herself, again, after maybe the second creepiest part of of this episode, which was when the dolls were moving around the dollhouse when Danny sneaks out of bed. But Danny burns the glasses in this. I guess it was meant to be figurative. I kind of hoped from years and years and years of watching the show Supernatural that we would see Flashlight Eyes just kind of burn up, but I have a feeling he's not gone just because she decided she was done carrying that. But I at least felt it was a big positive step forward for her character in the end. Of course, we're only in episode 4, and I'm sure Danny's got a lot more to deal with.
You made us promise that we wouldn't tell you.
I know. Well, I'm sitting here thinking like, oh, she's like trying to overcome, this terrible thing that has happened. And because one of the things we learned in this episode was she left home rather like really quickly because the mom had come over, Edmund's mom had come over to check on her, and that's when she got the glasses, and she was already packed, ready to go. And she had said the hospital sent these, sent some of his stuff back, and I didn't want these. And I thought, man, so the death must have just happened. Like they had just barely had the funeral. And then she just up and leaves. So she's really just running. So I was glad to see her finally confronted, but then again, like I said, this is episode 4, and I was like, oh no, this is not going to be the end for her. There's more. There's going to be more that she has to go through, and it's going to be heartbreaking and hard to watch. I know.
I mean, I don't think as a spoiler to say, yeah, there will be heartbreaking things upcoming and to watch. What things? I don't know.
What things? I'm tired of trying to figure this show out.
I'm surprised. I do think we need to go back to Miles screaming and cursing about alcohol, but there were 2 parts in this that really kind of scared me, maybe a little bit more than that. I don't know. That was pretty chilling. You're right. But the part when Danny sees the dollhouse open by itself creeps me out. And she goes over and she starts looking at the dolls, trying to figure out how they moved. And that was our quote that opened is, Flora, being Flora, totally nice and polite, just says like, please don't touch my stuff because I have a very particular system. And I was like, the first time I saw that, I was kind of creeped out. And then right after that is when, because when Owen comes from the funeral, Danny has a panic attack because she sees Edmund again. And she's in the hall and she sees Peter Quint looking through the windows, which if people have read Turn the Screw, those scenes where Peter Quint's looking in the windows are great, kind of recreation of that. And any Turn of the Screw adaptation, especially Innocence, kind of callbacks. And so she goes to the door with a poker, like almost hits Owen because she thinks it's Quint coming in. So she decides to ask the kids about Quint. And so she asks Flora, I'm not going to be mad, but are you and Miles letting Peter Quint in the house? Because there's one of the dolls. She says one of the dolls is Peter. And Flora says, we don't let him in the house. That's not how this works. And I was creeped out by that as well. The first time I watched this. And then, of course, after that, she goes to talk to Miles. And Miles, of course, does not remember screaming about wanting wine because he is not aware of what he does when Quint has possessed him. So that whole scene was like creepy child vibe on 10, maybe 11 for me.
Yeah. Well, it's so unsettling to have a child. And I think that's one of the things that is unsettling too about Flora, even though she seems more innocent. It's when children speak too much like adults. And Danny even like recognizes that at some point when she's giving Miles a talk about like how you get to pick your own family when you've lost so much. She says, I know you're forced to grow up fast. Like I was forced to grow up fast. And I know you want to act like an adult. But there is something very unsettling to see children acting too much like an adult or talking too much like an adult. And certainly like angrily screaming, give me my drink at dinner. I mean, part of me wanted to be like, pour the man a drink. Like it was terrifying. But I will say, because I don't want to forget it, but later when they were trying to protect Danny, after the dolls were moving around, Miles had to close the front door. And that mirrored what we saw in the dollhouse, right? Because she said the dollhouse kind of creepily opened. And she reminds Danny that that's not how this works. We don't let them in. And Miles kind of reaffirmed that at the end of the episode when he has to go and close the front door. I guess we don't know who came through the door at that point. but someone or something did. And that was one of my top scary moments of the episode.
That is also, though, and I mean, this is actually going back to a text conversation that we had earlier today, Lisa, but that's also when you realize that the kids are actually trying to protect the adults in the background. Because I know in the last episode we talked about, we were trying not to spoil things for you, but you were like really trying to figure out if the kids were evil. And for me, no matter what happens with Flora in particular after this, Miles, I was like, I figured he was being possessed by Quint, but I wasn't 100% sure with him because of school and whatnot. I don't know. The first time around, I was like, where's this going? But Flora, for all the creepy stuff that she does, I think this episode is when I realized on my first viewing that she actually is trying to do what's best. She just has a really creepy way of putting it across. Like, she tries to help Owen. She tries to explain to Danny that telling her that her parents are still around doesn't work because they're not. And yeah, she just knows that the dollhouse shows her where people are. And so she uses that to monitor. What we find out in the next episode is the ghost that comes in from outside the house. So we find out that some of their weird nocturnal behavior is actually because they're trying to help the adults, because the adults don't know the things that they know. Which complicates that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after I watched the scene, I did go back and rewatch the scene from episode 1 when they locked her in the closet, because we see here that they're trying to protect her. Either protect her from the ghost or just stop her from seeing the ghost. One way or another, they don't want the ghost. We're talking about, at this point, the faceless woman who comes in. But they're trying to keep them out of different parts of the house, right? And when in episode 1, when I went back and rewatched, and I hadn't picked this up in the first viewing, Danny had picked up that doll, the faceless doll, from under the dresser, and Flora had scolded her and said, put it back, she stays there. Well, then later, Danny steps on her because she's in the middle of the room, and the idea is that she's coming to the house. That's why the dolls are moving, and she picks it up, and that's when they put her in the closet. When they let her out of the closet and they're acting all sweet again, the camera pans and you see that doll is back under the dresser. So I was like, that is what is going on there. So I felt much better that the children actually are quite, at least in episode 4, we've got a while to go, but in episode 4, they're still sweet and innocent. And Miles seems to only be kind of violent, creepy Miles when he is possessed by Quint. So...
Well, and also that doll terrifies Flora, and you see that because Danny says, "Oh, look, your doll's like in the middle of the floor," and gives it to Flora, and Flora's like, "Ah!" Like she doesn't want to touch it. She's got this scared look on her face because, yeah, you're right. That means that the it's moving. And even later, when Danny goes to the basement to get the doll, Flora won't take it from her. So yeah, that's the one doll that Flora won't engage with, and so that was foreshadowed in like episode 1 and 2, which is cool, and why I like these shows so much, because everything is tied together with everything else.
Yeah, Mel, I agree with you that this show is just, it's so well done, because as you start to see things unfold, you do see that they were kind of foreshadowed. Before we move to episode 5, because I definitely want to talk about episode 5, I just also want to point out that in this episode, kind of in the interest of dropping clues, that we learn a few new names in this episode. Viola Lloyd was the name of the floor on the chapel, in the engraved in the stone, and then there was also a Lloyd in the graveyard. So Viola and Lloyd, both those names come from A Romance of Certain Old Clothes, which I know is an episode title later. So I'm assuming all of this ties in later. But again, I don't know for sure how it all ties together, but I will point that out, that we've kind of got new names popping up. But let's talk about episode 5, The Altar of the Dead, which was, I got so excited when this started and I realized this was going to be Hannah Gross's episode, because I've been wanting to hear her story. Although after watching episode 5, and it thoroughly gutted me, I wish I hadn't been so excited to know her background.
That was my exact feeling when I watched episode 5 the first time as well, because I had so many questions going into it. And by the end, I was like, well, you answered them. I kind of wish you hadn't now. So, yeah, that episode stands out as one of the best in the series, to be honest. And I don't think that that's going to spoil any of the remaining ones for you. I think you probably can already tell it was a really good episode in its own right. But for me, in my opinion, that's one of the best, just in the way that it jumps around through time and other things. But yeah, I love that episode, but it's also really hard to watch even a second time.
Yes. I mean, this was one of those episodes that I was just like, oh my gosh. It was devastating. I don't think I am alone in my ideas that Hannah and Owen are my favorite characters in this season. Like they've just got a wonderful rapport. There seems to be a lot of warmth between the two of them, and affection, and maybe promise. That, yeah, I was excited to get her episode, because what we knew going in and the questions that we had, or at least that I had, we knew she tended to kind of lose herself a lot. I even noted it in episode 4 when they were sitting there at the bonfire. Like at some point, she looks like she's looking off into the fire, and it's like she goes somewhere else. And that was what she was doing when we met her at the beginning of this whole, back in episode 1, she was looking off. And so we don't really, that was part of it, like what's going on with her. I know we had questioned like where she was, since she did live on the property. She doesn't seem to like to be around too much at night. Like she goes to bed rather quickly. She wasn't there, and this is something we brought up in episode 1, that when Danny was locked in the closet and like obviously screaming, she didn't come to help. And so that seemed bizarre. She spends an awful lot of time in the chapel lighting candles for the dead, which there was that one candle that we didn't know about. Matt, I remember you and I actually talked about that, that she had, we had counted the people that we knew were dead, and then she had lit one more, and we were kind of like, okay, we don't know what's going on with that. She's seeing cracks appear, and it's the same crack over and over again. Like I actually drew it in my notes because I was like, it's vaguely tree-like. So I was trying to figure out, does that mean something? And I think I've mentioned this in our other discussions of this, that she does not eat. I think we finally see her drinking wine at some point, but I was like, she does not sit down and eat with the family. And that always kind of unnerved me a little bit about her, because I was just like, there's just too much we don't know. But anyway, this episode, for a lot of it, it begins with Hannah and Owen talking by the fire, and he wants her to run away to Paris. And, she's just kind of like, why? Like, I could never do that. And he basically says, I just want us to drink good wine and live. And I thought that was such a sweet, like, sentiment at the beginning of the episode. But she's kind of she's remembering, we're going through her memories. And for a while, I couldn't figure out what was happening. And so I wrote down a few of my thoughts. I didn't know if she was losing time. I thought at one point, I was like, because she seemed to be touching the back of her head or her neck. So my mind was even going to like, does she have like a brain tumor? And this is causing her to like lose time a little bit. I wondered if the way they were like, Owen was talking about his mom, there had been so much focus on dementia, if she wasn't suffering from some sort of like early onset dementia. And that was going to be like the thing that we were following. Because it was all very fractured in this episode, and she was going in and out. But then at some point, like she's even in memories that aren't hers, because she starts to like go into Rebecca and Quint's relationship. And there's kind of a question of how are you seeing this? How are you in this memory? And I was just, at one point, I was just like, what is going on? We learn that I guess she had a husband named Sam who is now with a new woman, and this made her very sad. So I was trying to figure out where they were going with that. I'm just going to ask you guys, did either of you see what was happening like before it happened? Because I'll be honest, I think I figured it out about 5 seconds before they showed it. It floored me.
I had my suspicions throughout the episode. It wasn't until really that episode that I started to really think that was a real possibility. I'd kind of wondered because, you know, especially the not eating like we talked about. But yeah, I sort of maybe halfway through the episode that it was possible, but I wasn't 100% sure until it happened.
If I'm remembering right, it was slightly spoiled for me, unfortunately, beforehand. It was my own fault. I saw something online that mentioned that the Hannah episode was kind of like similar to what they did with Bent Neck Lady to a certain extent. And I was like, oh, I love timey-wimey fractured stuff. And then I accidentally saw that, you know, if you speculate that Hannah Gross was dead, you were right. But I did not know how it happened or anything. So all I knew when I went into it was, I didn't even know if this was the episode per se that was going to show us how she had passed. I wondered even if she, as we talked when none of us, I think, had seen beyond episode 1, if she was just a ghost. So it's like finding out how it happened and when it happened. Ripped my heart out and blew my mind all at the same time, because this, you know, Hannah was alive up until the very moment that Danny met her is what happens. Like, we are basically seeing why she was looking in the well, rubbing her neck and looking confused, and why Miles was confused, because Miles didn't know what he had done. And then, of course, in the episode that gives us the background on Quint and Jessel, when the kids are sleeping, when Hannah wakes Miles up, Miles is upset, and he says, Hannah, I had this nightmare. I think I might have hurt you. And she's like, oh, there's no way that you would do that. And so she doesn't seem to understand that she's dead at that point. And he doesn't know, his subconscious, I guess, is letting him know that he killed her, but he doesn't know that. And so that's part of how we know that he's not fully cognizant of what's going on. But yeah, that end just destroyed me, because I guess I kind of thought, well, if she's a ghost, if she's been a ghost, that's cool. That's interesting. I didn't think like, Quint used Miles to murder her, which is, you know, it makes you realize just how truly dangerous Quint is, beyond his obviously psychologically abusive and verging on physical abuse of Jessel and his threats against Hannah. But the fact that he uses Miles to do it, I think, also adds an extra wrinkle to what he's capable of, and makes us think about what he could be capable of in these episodes that we have yet to see. But yeah, knowing that Hannah is basically decomposing at the bottom of the well the whole time all these characters are having these interactions with her, and her relationships are deepening with them, is just completely heartbreaking. And I think I mentioned this to you, Lisa. It reminds me a little bit of the movie Ghost Story, which we talked about, which is the idea of when you're a ghost, if your psychology continues, then what are you going to want? Like, if you're not tied to time or place, what happened? And so you have her literally being a ghost and not knowing it, not knowing she died. And so there's this there's possible existential crisis because she's constantly repressing what had happened and using her memories to do that. And then she ends up realizing that she needs to protect the children. So she's got to center herself. She's got to constantly tell herself who she is and what time period she's in so that she can continue doing what she needs to do to help the people in the present. And it gives her character an extra tragic dimension that is great for storytelling, but horrible when you like the character.
Oh, it's absolutely devastating, because even as she was, because what we see, kind of the psychological part that you were talking about, because so much of this television show is dealing with trauma. Like that's where like the heart of the horror, I think, lies, is how people both move through trauma, but what happens also when you don't deal with trauma, and how the more you try to ignore it or run away from it, the more it's going to bubble up to the surface, which is obviously what's happening with her. And that's why we were seeing the crack all over the place, because to some degree she is in denial with what happened. But so much of the memories and the kind of the questioning happens with her and Owen. She's replaying conversations that she's had with him, in particular the interview that when she first met him, which is obviously like a really important memory for her. It was a really good memory for her. But her psychology is kind of using that moment to ask her. One of the things is, Owen in that scene, and I'm kind of using air quotes around Owen because I guess it's more like Owen that's in her memory. So it's like her being Owen, I guess, asked if Miles was ever cruel. And she really resists that because, like you said, that's part of what she's wanting to stay to do, is to protect the children. And so she's really resistant to this idea of like labeling him as a bad kid or as a cruel kid. Because I think even she recognizes that it's something that he had no control over and that he didn't necessarily want to do. Also, when I went back after I watched this episode, I was like, oh, I got to go back and now watch some of the early scenes that we get with her, because it was very jarring. I mean, I had kind of wondered, since she wasn't eating, if she wasn't a ghost, or if more people in the house were not ghosts that we didn't know about. So that didn't shock me too much. It shocked me in the way she died. And it shocked me, like Mel, you pinpointed it, the timing of it, because it was literally as Danny was pulling up with Owen. So for all they know, I mean, she was still, she was still alive just moments before. But when we see her in the chapel and she's lighting that candle that we had questioned, what is that candle for? Obviously now we know she was lighting a candle for herself. And she's talking with Danny, and she's talking about the children and how much they've been through. And there's just kind of a moment where she's like, they've been through so much. And then she kind of stops, and you can tell she's reflecting, and she's like, oh, Flora. And that just broke me when I saw that, because it was almost like, the actress is so good. You can see it on her face without her actually saying it, that not only is she trying to process the fact that she's died, and she's trying to stay present, and you're right, every time she repeats the year, and she repeats the ages of the children, and she repeats where she is. I'm here at Bly Manor, it's 1987. Flora is 8, Miles is 10. She's trying to ground herself in time so that she can stay present and she can stay there and not become like the other ghosts who have forgotten themselves. Because remember, that's a big theme so far, is that the faceless woman has forgotten her own name. She doesn't know who she is anymore. And so she's trying not to do that. But you also see how much she cares for the children, because she realizes she's just put them through more trauma. And that was really when, like, when I say this episode gutted me, like at that point I was just sobbing, like crazy sobbing, because I was just like, Miles and Flora, I can't take anything else. Like their parents have died. Like, forget the fact that they live on Bly Manor, which apparently is like a magnet for ghosts and is the most haunted place in the world. But their parents have died, and then their governess, who they love, died in this really traumatic way. And Miles is dealing with this really like possessive, violent, mean spirit. And now, like, she's gone. And I was just like, they can't deal with that, you know? It was just devastating.
And I think that part of the tragedy, though, is that she can't deal with it either, because we realize in the episode that she didn't really know that she was dead really until the bonfire, I don't think. Because she doesn't, like, she can't figure out why she's moving around in the memories. That's why she keeps having the debate with Owen. Owen says she's in denial. So she may know she's dead, but she just doesn't want to face it. Because, you know, Owen reminds her of the story she told about the mouse in the trap. And she's like, so when a person is in a trap, or when a person is dying, or a person is dead, like, what is it he says? Do we know when it's already over? And then he screams denial at her. I think it's interesting to think that she's unconsciously lighting a candle for herself. I assumed the candle was for Sam, because Charlotte told her Sam is basically dead to you. Let's light a candle all the time for him. But maybe she is like unconsciously lighting a candle for herself, even though she doesn't want to face the fact that she's dead. But then she has to in the end, because she tries to change the memory to tell Owen that she wants to go to Paris with him, and she can't, and she cannot get off the grounds of Bly, which is another thing. If you die at Bly, you can't get off. You can't leave it. And she finds that out in a pretty horrifying way when she tries to like finally live. You know, when Owen yells at her, "Live, Hannah, live while you're still alive," or something to that effect. I put a little crying face next to it in my notes, because I'm like, we know she's not alive. And by the end of the episode, when he says that she knows she isn't, and there's nothing she can do about it. But yeah, I kind of felt like her going through her memories was her way of trying to deal. It's like, this isn't exactly what I'm thinking, but it's like when mediums are telling spirits, go to the light, right? Like, oh, they're just confused and like hanging around here because they don't know. But I truly think that she didn't. It's just like Peter Quint. When the faceless woman from the lake kills Peter Quint, he just shows up as a ghost. It doesn't even know he was killed, right? So she's in this in-between state where she doesn't understand what's happening to her. And that just adds to the horror and the tragedy of it, because she's just as clueless as we are.
This is such a devastating episode. That moment at the end where you're right, where she does kind of fully realize that she's never going to leave, and that she is dead, and she's going to, you know, be a spirit at Bly now forever. When she watches Owen and Jamie walk away after he does his little, you know, punny alcohol you later. And I was just like, that was a rough scene. And you're right. Like in this episode, we find out that Quint is dead. Like, we didn't know up until this point. We just knew Quint was missing. I mean, I assumed Quint was a ghost because he's a ghost in the Henry James version. I do like, though, that they've kept Quint just kind of being pure evil, because he was always so scary in Turn of the Screw. And you could look at it throughout, like reading the James story of, you know, are the children, you know, possessed or not? Are the ghosts real or are they not? But like, Quint was always just a scary figure in that story. And I'm glad that Quint, because even in this episode, like even when we see him like being sweet with Miss Jessel, it's just kind of like, he's so manipulative. You can't trust anything he does or says. And I mean, he's just mean. Like at his core, he is just mean. And it was very eerie when Mrs. Gross got into Rebecca's memory, and we see that, like, when they were in bed together and he gets out and she says, I think this is when it happened. Like, don't go out there. That was a scary moment because you're like, oh my gosh, what are we about to see? But even seeing Quint, like, dragged away and possess Miles, and we realize, like, he's gone, I guess, drowned, or he's been killed by the spirit and is, like, now in the lake, and just they didn't know. Even then, I really didn't care. I was like, yeah, whatever. Which, I mean, honestly, like, this episode was all about, like, it broke my heart because, you know, this was her episode, and it was such a sweet episode. It was such a heartbreaking episode. And I mean, yeah, Quinn is dead, but I didn't care.
Yeah, I'm of two minds about that, because when he gets killed, I'm like, oh, well, but he is more evil, right? Because we find out that he is using his ghostliness to do even more terrible things. And his ghostliness is making him, he has nothing to lose. He can't be arrested. Like, he could kill whoever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. He tells Hannah, like, I wish you could call the police and they could put me in jail because, like, you know, I'm dead and I can't leave Bly. And so this is a man who has gone from thinking he was on the edge of freedom to being trapped, and has nothing to lose. And I feel like, while I didn't care that he got killed, he's just as dangerous, if not worse, dead. So there's that.
Seeing his first, like, possession of Miles, like, seeing when he realizes that he can possess Miles, that was very disturbing. And it also makes that episode of Miles at school even that much more heartbreaking because he was safe there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Miles deliberately put himself back in danger because he didn't want to leave his sister alone. Yeah.
Yeah, when he goes back to Jessel and she yells at him for what he said to her about Owen and the cake batter and all that, and he tries to act like it never happened, he is just a horrible, horrible person. And yeah, he's been unleashed in a whole new way, and that's also part of Hannah's tragedy as well. And she couldn't have seen it coming. Yeah. She doesn't realize it until the very end.
I want to go back and, like, redo this episode and just be like, just don't stand so close to the well. And then when Owen says run off to Paris, just say, yeah, we'll leave right now, this second, like, right this second.
But then what about the children and Danny and Jamie?
I mean, I don't want anything bad to happen to them, but I just really need Hannah and Owen to be okay. And I think, and this is what is heartbreaking to me too, is I didn't go back and watch all of the episodes up until episode 5 again. I went back and rewatched parts of them to see, like, now that I knew what was going on with Hannah, I was like, I want to go back and see some of her scenes. And so I went back to watch some of them. And the thing that is really heartbreaking too, and kind of got me going again with the crying and the sobbing and the sniffling after this episode, was that I don't think any of the other characters know that she's not alive.
No, they don't. I mean, they just think they're interacting with her. Yeah.
I kind of wonder, there was, like, I don't think, I mean, obviously I don't think Miles knows what he did. He doesn't remember it. And he's, you know, so he doesn't know. I kind of wondered sometimes if Flora doesn't suspect something, because it seems like she's really keen at seeing the ghost in a way that other people aren't. But then again, I don't know that for certain. But that's what makes it heartbreaking too, because I just keep now looking at all these people that I'm falling in love with, and I'm like, y'all are gonna get your heart broken when you realize. And I mean, poor Owen. It's not fair. Why? Mike Flanagan, I have words for you. That's all I have to say about that. I will also say I loved it when Owen quoted Hamlet to her. Not really, I guess it wasn't really Owen. It was like her mind as Owen, trying to get her to understand. And he used that line from Hamlet, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, which I thought was a nice little, even though it was heartbreaking, it was nice. And I guess the other main thing in this episode is that we know now where the muddy footprints are coming from. Now that there's this faceless woman who doesn't know who she is, who has Quint and is coming back and forth from the lake to the house and is leaving the footprints. So we kind of knew that before, but this confirmed it in this episode.
Sidebar. Want to close it out? We're at like 55 minutes.
I can do that. All right. I don't know. I've got to say, guys, I am nervous to continue on. Like, I want to. I really can't wait to continue on with more episodes of this show. I'm nervous because my heart's already been broken in two. And like I said, we're only on episode 5. So I'm sure there's lots more to come. And if we are kind of comparing this, Mel, you had mentioned The Haunting of Hill House, and I think it was episode 5 or 6 where we learned about the bent neck lady and that kind of twist. But there were still a whole lot of heartache. There was a lot of heartache to come after even that revelation. So I don't know. I better just buckle myself in because I don't think it's going to get any easier to watch some of these things. Like I said, in my head, I'm just rewriting it. And she didn't stand so close to the well, and she's fine. And her and Owen ran off to Paris, and they are drinking good wine as we speak. That's the way I choose to believe it. But what I would really love is if any of our listeners have watched this TV show, The Haunting of Bly Manor, and particularly want to talk about episodes 4 and 5, I would love to do that because even though we covered quite a bit in this episode, I took a lot of notes. And there's a lot more, I'm sure, to talk about in these, and probably things that I missed that because I was sobbing, I did not pick up on. So with that in mind, I will just go ahead and tell our listeners that we'd love to hear from you. We are across social media. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. Don't forget that it's No Fear with a K-N-O-W. And we also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, you can send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. So we do mini episodes on the weeks that we're not releasing our main episodes, and our patrons get to listen to those. So we usually do a deeper dive into the subject. I'm sure I'll still be talking about Owen and Hannah over on that one. But if you can't spend the money for a Patreon exclusive content, we completely understand because 2020 has not been easy for any of us. But one thing that you can do is simply rate and review us. If you haven't done that already, just go ahead and however you listen to us, whatever, podcasting service you listen to us on, just go ahead and tap a rating. It's entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us and kind of gives us a boost in that algorithm. So if you do that, we would be forever grateful. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.